George Michael's music captivated listeners worldwide. He rose to fame as a member of the mega-successful pop duo Wham! In the 1980s and went on to launch a solo career and sold millions of records. But behind the scenes, his personal life was not without struggle. In his home on Christmas Day in 2016, he was found dead. Growing up in and around London, George Michael was one of the top performers in popular music during the 1980s and 1990s. It was then that he first discovered his love for music. George made friends with Andrew Ridgeley in high school because they both loved pop music, and they started performing together. According to some accounts, Michael and Ridgeley were an unusual pair. In 1982, they signed a recording deal with Inner Vision Records and changed their name to Wham!
One of the things that's so fascinating about Wham! Is they never thought it was going to be a group or a project that went on indefinitely. It was all about being young and having fun and celebrating that moment, but also reflecting what was happening in politics and culture at that moment.
And they couldn't even know at the beginning what they had. But Andrew was clearly the personality, the charismatic figure, the dancer. He was the kind of guy that George would look at with admiration, and that's because, of course, George was shy, and he had, I guess, the deeper thoughts. Of course, it turned out he was the better songwriter, which is no insult to Andrew, because he was a better songwriter than almost anyone.
Fantastic! Their debut album was released in the UK in 1982 and peaked at number 4 on the charts. Wham! Lived up to the title of their second album, Make It Big, in 1984, with their infectious Motown-inspired sound. Their first number 1 hit in the US was Wake Me Up Before You Go Go, which peaked at the top of the US charts and stayed there for 3 weeks. The bubblegum pop song also reached the top of the charts in the UK, with the track eventually going platinum by selling over 2 million copies.
Something that I think people don't realize really about Wham, because it's so upbeat and so fun and so danceable, was that they were infusing their music with these messages of what was happening and what real life was like for kids at that moment in time.
Michael also sang the holiday song, Do They Know It's Christmas, with the nonprofit Band-Aid in 1984 to raise money for famine relief in Ethiopia. Michael and Ridgeley contributed the profits from their popular holiday song, Last Christmas, and Everything She Wants to Band-Aid's philanthropic endeavors. A year later, on April 7, 1985, Wham! Became the first Western pop group to perform in China. In just a few years, Wham! Had become extremely successful, turning George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley into international celebrities. From their time as school buddies, they had traveled the world together and performed in front of thousands of fans. However, it was evident that George was the band's most popular vocalist, and because of his celebrity status, there was a desire for him to pursue a solo career. George was the driving force behind the pair's decision to call it quits, even though he never officially left Wham!
I think basically we want to turn it all around. I mean, there's no point in trying to tell people that we're not splitting up, but I think it should be the most amicable split in pop history if we do it properly.
According to a remark, he aimed to write to more honest emotions in his records, creating songs that people could personally relate to.
When Careless Whisper was released, it was billed as Wham! Featuring George Michael. In this country, of course, it was just billed as George Michael. That was the first George Michael single. But it had been co-credited to George and Andrew. And Wham! Had 3 straight number 1s in America. Wake Me Up Before You Go Go, A Careless Whisper, and then Everything She Wants. And suddenly, their original singles on Inner Vision had not been hits in America, but now they were this huge act.
He aimed to appeal to a new audience and set himself apart from Wham's younger followers. The song's enormous success was, in many respects, the start of the end.
George Michael was the most successful British solo artist in America during the 1980s, and Wham were the most successful British duo in the United States during the 1980s, so he really cleaned up.
Ambulance emergency. Is the patient conscious and breathing?
No, it's George Michael. I think he's dead. He's in
You
bed.
think he's dead?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, so he's not breathing.
He's not breathing.
What's his name?
It's George Michael, you know the singer?
Christmas Day, 2016. George Michael's home in Goring-on-Thames. A call reporting he's been found unresponsive.
It's a great loss. George was a great soul. He's one of the greatest philanthropists in the history of popular music. And also, he was one of the greatest talents.
Within minutes, the news breaks worldwide, and the speculation begins just as fast. Headlines ask about his partner, Fadi Fawaz, the man who made the 999 call. When was he last seen? Tabloids start pushing angles. Was it drugs? A relapse? Hidden health issues? Old rumors resurface, stories about past struggles, and even outdated baseless whispers about AIDS, recycled from the 90s and thrown back into circulation by outlets hungry for clicks.
George Michael faced obviously many challenges, but one of them was his sexuality. And for anyone, I mean, hopefully less so than it used to be, but it's still challenging for many people to come out as gay. What you have here is with George Michael's sexuality, it's the same issue that you have compounded by addiction.
The media frenzy ramps up. Every unanswered question turns into a new headline. Reporters swarm Fawaz. Social media runs wild with theories. Commentators debate everything except the confirmed facts, because at that point, there aren't any. Meanwhile, Thames Valley Police issue a simple line: no suspicious circumstances. But the doubt doesn't fade. Not yet. But on that night, in those first hours, it didn't matter. The moment the 999 call became public knowledge, the story didn't just break, it exploded.
I think he found it quite lonely being a solo artist, to be fair, because it's only him. Everything's dependent on him. There's nobody else to take the focus off of, the solo person.
George Michael's death became one of the most scrutinized final chapters in modern pop history.
OK, we've got some breaking news coming to us here via Thames Valley Police, who have confirmed the death of the singer George Michael at the age of 53.
The confirmation lands, and everything moves at once. Outside his home in Goring-on-Thames, fans start to gather almost immediately. A trickle becomes a crowd. Flowers, candles, photographs, letters, layered along the brick wall until the pavement is filled. Some people stand in silence, others share memories, and the sound of his voice drifts through the cold air from portable speakers. Radio stations across the UK flip their schedules on the spot. Out go the pre-recorded holiday programs. In comes George Michael on repeat. Wham, solo hits, live sessions, hour after hour. Presenters speak softly, playing longer tracks, knowing the audience is listening differently. And while tributes rise, the speculation begins to spread just as fast. Reporters focus on the circumstances, the timing, the silence around details. Fadi Fawaz, his partner, suddenly becomes a central figure, identified, pursued, questioned in every direction.
But whatever happened with that new partner and drugs, added on top of the actual physical illness that he had developed, he couldn't turn it around. I'm so frustrated.
Then the old stories reappear. Rumors about drugs resurface. Everything from past struggles to whispers of relapse. Columns revive outdated claims about his health from decades earlier. Even the long-dismissed AIDS narrative gets dragged back into the spotlight. None of it verified, all of it amplified. Through the night, the frenzy grows. Satellite vans line the village road. Social feeds flood with theories and half-formed sources. News channels loop the same footage of the house, the fans, the flashing candles at the gate. By morning, George Michael has become the world's dominant headline. His home is now a vigil. His music is everywhere, and the swirl around his final hours is expanding with every broadcast, every post, every rumor passed along as if it might be truth. The frenzy has fully taken hold, loud, fast, emotional, and completely unstoppable.
Try to get me wet. That's all. Done a good job. Sorry, Ron. Thank you.
The investigation into George Michael's death didn't unfold in isolation. To understand what led to those final chapters, you have to trace the events that shaped him, professionally, personally, and publicly. It begins years earlier with a battle that changed the music industry, the Sony court case.
George was a man of principle, and whether it was the commercial principle of sell my music as music rather than as an offshoot of videos, or if you don't respect me as a person, then you can't possibly respect me as an artist. Both of those approaches are valid.
In the early 90s, George challenged his own record label, arguing his contract was restrictive.
When I was 18 years old, I entered into a recording contract with CBS Records. At 30 years old, my contract still has 10 years to run.
Outdated and artistically suffocating. It was bold, almost unheard of at that scale. The case dragged on, became a global headline.
But George lost the case. In a way, he won, because Sony realized we don't want to have somebody who doesn't want to be with us. And that's why he briefly went to one label and then somewhere else.
The fight defined him. It painted him as an artist unwilling to be controlled, someone determined to create on his own terms, even if it came with consequences.
You sign a piece of paper at the beginning of your career, and you're expected to live with that decision, good or bad, for the rest of your professional life.
But behind that professional war, something far heavier was happening privately. George had fallen in love with Anselmo Filippa, a Brazilian dress designer he met in the late 80s. It was a relationship he described as transformative, his first experience of that kind of deep connection. Only months after they met, Anselmo was diagnosed with HIV. George lived through the uncertainty, the fear, and the secrecy that the era demanded. And when Anselmo died in 1993, it devastated him.
Well, after that, there was a kind of necessary hiatus, really, because I had to get on with grieving. And I was kind of in a form of inertia that meant I wasn't writing anything. And that went on for about the best part of 2 years.
And that's enough for any of us to cope with. But when you were already vulnerable, when you were already coping, for instance, as he was, with a buried truth about his sexuality and his identity, that becomes very difficult.
He kept the grief largely hidden from the public, carrying the weight quietly because he still wasn't out.
George wrote this very reflective song about Anselmo, Jesus to a Child. I think that was the way he came out. And it was very heroic because it was open, it was honest, and it was as serious a song as there could be.
Just a few years later, another blow, the death of his mother, Leslie. He'd always said she was his anchor, the person whose approval mattered most.
You know, it went into remission, I guess, for 3 or 4 months, and then came back with a vengeance, and within a week of that, she was gone.
Everything changed in a single moment in a Beverly Hills park. The arrest made worldwide news. A lewd act sting operation by undercover police. Suddenly, George Michael was outed before he got to tell his own story. But instead of retreating, he owned it.
then by the time I'd kind of worked out what it was and I'd stopped having relationships with women, I was just so indignant at the way I'd been treated until then. I was just thought, well, I'll just hold on to this. I don't think they need to know. I don't think I should have to tell them. But, you know, this is as good a time as any.
The scandal that was meant to shame him instead became the moment he publicly stepped into his identity. It was messy, unfair, and deeply intrusive, but he transformed it into liberation. In 2010 came another headline: the crash into a North London Snappy Snap store. A minor accident, but the aftermath wasn't. Police found cannabis. Questions about drug use resurfaced. Courts handed him a driving ban and a short sentence. The media ran with the narrative. Was he struggling again? Was this a relapse? The scrutiny intensified, pulling every past detail back into the spotlight.
In reality, I've been sentenced today on the basis of unfit driving through tiredness and prescription medicines, which I fully accept responsibility for. We all have a sleep, don't worry. I am glad to put this behind me, and now I'm off to do the biggest show of my life.
Yet, even with the noise around him, another crisis loomed, this one far more dangerous. In 2011, on tour in Europe, George developed severe pneumonia. He was rushed to the hospital in Vienna, placed in intensive care, and at one point, his condition was described as critical. Fans gathered outside the hospital. News channels run updates hourly. It was one of the closest brushes with death he'd had, and when he finally walked out weeks later, thin but smiling, he called it the worst experience of his life.
But I'm incredibly, incredibly fortunate to be here, and incredibly fortunate to have picked up this bug where I did, because apparently the hospital in Austria that they rushed me to was absolutely the best place in the world I could have been.
A life lived publicly, a struggle lived privately, and an investigation trying to piece together the truth behind the final chapter. The investigation took its first sharp turn when the initial autopsy came back inconclusive. No immediate answers, no confirmed cause, just a statement saying more tests were needed. That vacuum opened the door to weeks of speculation, each theory louder than the last. George's publicist stepped in to steady the story, repeating one clear message: George wasn't ill, not in a way anyone around him had recognized. He hadn't been battling a known condition. There was no warning, no buildup, nothing that suggested he was on the brink of anything serious. But as toxicology and specialist analyses continued, the narrative started to shift quietly behind closed doors. When the final results were eventually delivered, they weren't dramatic. They weren't shocking. They didn't match the frenzy that had built around his name. The conclusion was simple, almost disarmingly so. George Michael's heart had simply given up. No scandal, no hidden secret, no sudden revelation waiting to explode. Just a body worn down by the weight of a complicated life, years of pressure, emotional trauma, relentless scrutiny, and a private struggle to stay afloat long after the camera stopped rolling.
Whenever celebrities die, there's always some dispute over an autopsy, There's always some mystery because the great conspiracy theorists and fans and pundits all like to speculate that the truth is buried somewhere and there's somebody trying to hide something. And of course, sometimes that's the case. But sometimes, when like the family of George Michael who didn't want to release the autopsy report, well, they just want privacy. Why not? What do they want to do? Subject George to yet more public scrutiny when he's dead, subject his dead body and therefore his moral failings to the light of the public gaze, to subject his mental health problems to the judgment of the press without any right of reply. I mean, it's a spectacle, and around many of these celebrities there's a spectacle of misery, a circus of misery that people feed off, and it's an ugly spectacle.
In the months after his death, as the noise faded and the speculation burned itself out, a different picture of George began to surface. One not built on headlines, but on truth. And it came through quietly, piece by piece. There was renewed spotlight on George Michael, Freedom, the documentary he'd been deeply involved in before he died. It wasn't promotional. It wasn't a vanity project. It was his voice, finally shaping his own story.
And ultimately, he did come out as a gay man. He lived as a gay man, and he died as a gay man. And in that alone, given the extraordinary adversity that he had to fight against, is a remarkable triumph. And let's remember him for that triumph.
George Michael was defined through generosity, with honesty, and with voice that traveled further than he ever did. A legacy measured not just in albums sold, but in lives touched.
He did have it all, like his #1 heroes, Stevie Wonder and Elton John. He was of international caliber.